Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie on Wednesday, October the 29th, 2025. Today, Mars makes a trine aspect to Saturn. That's Mars in Scorpio, trine Saturn in Pisces. And it's all part of a grand trine because Mars is also making a trine to Jupiter. We had that yesterday, and now we've got the trine to Saturn, and Jupiter is pretty close to making a trine to Saturn as well. So these three planets, Mars, Jupiter and Saturn, are very much in focus. And in today's video, I do want to spend some time talking about Mars trine Saturn and what it might mean. But before I do that, I want to consider the astrology and the I Ching for today, which is Wednesday, October the 29th, 2025. So here is the chart for today. Don't forget to like and subscribe if appropriate. So the moon is now in Aquarius. So you can see that at noon today. On Wednesday, the New York time, the moon is at 6 degrees. Is at 6 degrees Aquarius, and it's making aspects to, well, it's making a sextile aspect to Uranus, and it's making a trine aspect to Uranus, and a, sextile aspect to Neptune. Well, it does that just before it changes sign. I think that moon sextile Neptune is more a feature of Europe, Australia, New Zealand. Doesn't really affect you if you're in the Americas. So that's the moon, and of course you can see that the moon is making a conjunction to Pluto. Now, aside from that, we've got Mercury doing stuff. So you can see that Mercury is at 0 degrees 13 Sagittarius. So today Mercury has switched signs, and that is a big sign change. Mercury moving into a fire sign. It's been in a water sign for some time. We've been getting used to there being a lot of water, there being 3 planets in Scorpio. Now there are only 2 planets in Scorpio, and we have a planet in fire signs. So finally, the fire issue, the fire drought is over. And so Mercury in Sagittarius, does give us, some more energy. We can start to see connections, but that perhaps weren't there before. Though we shouldn't forget that Mercury in Sagittarius is in its detriment. So Mercury rules Gemini. Therefore, when it's in the opposite sign of Sagittarius, there can be a few issues. Mercury in Sagittarius can be very exciting, but if you think about it, Sagittarius is the wrong place for Mercury to be in. I mean, Mercury likes to respond with its mind, wants to perhaps think things through, and is in its own way quite a detailed orientated planet. But then in Sagittarius, it wants to reach big conclusions, and Mercury is not necessarily equipped to jump to conclusions. And so with Mercury in Sagittarius, we might be very ready to take action, but maybe we haven't fully seen it through. So that is a possible manifestation of Mercury being in Sagittarius. And when Mercury moves into Sagittarius, it makes a trine to Neptune and an opposition to Uranus. So that Mercury opposition Uranus, it's quite excitable. Mercury opposition Uranus, there are things to be said, and we might open our mouths, say what's on our mind, and the results may not be ideal. So we have to be careful here, because it's good to be spontaneous, but we can be too spontaneous. And maybe there's been all this energy building up. We haven't had a chance to say what was on our mind. We just waited and waited. We were waiting for the right moment and it didn't come. And then finally, it feels we have a chance. And so in our exuberance, or at least in some people's exuberance, we might jump to conclusions or say something that is unwise. And of course, when Mercury moves into Sagittarius, it can be free-speaking and sometimes rather tactless, not really thinking about the consequences of what it says. So maybe we need to be a little more considered and remember that, just before Mercury moves into Sagittarius, it does make a trine to Neptune. And even when it moves into Sagittarius, it's still in trine to Neptune. And so with that Mercury trine Neptune, that might ask us to use our sensitivity. Mercury trine Neptune, you could associate that with psychic stuff, being able to slowly become aware of things on an emotional level even, and there could be a telepathic dimension to Mercury trine Neptune, although when you're dealing with a trine, you're talking about the fast flow of information or the easy flow of information. So on an emotional level, we might pick up a lot, and once we picked it all up, we might want to reach rapid conclusions, and our conclusions might be too rapid. But possibly the main aspect of the day is Mars trine Saturn. Now, this Mars trine Saturn, can't see it in isolation. It's all part of a grand trine. So this grand trine that I've been going on and on about is very much there, continues to be there. And with Mars trine Saturn, you might say that Saturn is having a moderating influence. So Mars is, all the stuff we want to do and all our energy. Mars in Scorpio. Okay, it might be in Scorpio, but it's still Mars in a good sign, a sign that it rules. But then trine Saturn, that might be about it being easy to restrain ourselves. We can't do everything at once, and we need to just pause for a moment, not feel that we have to do everything at once, and perhaps have a little bit of focus and discipline. That is one way of looking at Mars trine Saturn. So when you see Mars trine Saturn, you might be thinking that it's a fortunate aspect. And that is the question. Is it a fortunate aspect? You can certainly see how it could be fortunate because Saturn is providing some level of control. On the other hand, it's Mars and Saturn. Mars and Saturn are a pair of planets which I'm in my own way quite obsessed about. I find the Mars-Saturn pair interesting, and with this Mars-Saturn pair, there can be a sense of frustration, and it is connected with death and destruction when these two planets come together. And so Mars trine Saturn may be about death. Could say about an easy death, something happening quickly. And you've also got Jupiter on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. So it's not exactly on the Mars-Saturn midpoint, but the Mars-Saturn midpoint is about 25, 50. But Jupiter's about a degree away from the Mars-Saturn midpoint. And we had this yesterday. So with Jupiter on the Mars-Saturn midpoint, how do you see that? You could see that as being easy death. And that's one way of looking at it. If it's Jupiter, you think about Jupiter being the planet of good fortune. It's possible with Jupiter on the Mars-Saturn midpoint, but we can benefit from someone else's misfortune. Or maybe it's not us benefiting. It could be someone else benefiting from our misfortune. I'm not predicting misfortune, by the way. But the question is, where are the gains? And the gains could be made in places that aren't obvious. We might think that something is a real disaster, but it could be an opportunity. And so maybe that's another positive way of looking at Mars trine Saturn. We have to look at the various hiccups and disasters and frustrations going on today and ask ourselves, well, maybe we can benefit from them in some way. So that's the picture in New York set for noon. If we set the chart for Sydney, Australia, we see that at noon the moon is at 28 degrees Capricorn. So this does mean that if you are in Australia or New Zealand or East Asia, for most of the day the moon is not in Aquarius, it's in Capricorn. And that might mean perhaps that the day is slightly more restrained. You don't have, for example, moon trine Uranus. It doesn't happen until late in the day, and with moon in Capricorn, it's a more sort of sensible place for the moon to be in. So if you are in Australia or New Zealand, then for the first part of the day you can be quite sort of disciplined and organized, and you can perhaps finish things off, though in the end the moon will move into Aquarius, so perhaps be ready for a change of pace over the course of the afternoon. And then there is the heliocentric view. Here it is. There is a quincunx between Mercury and Jupiter. So heliocentrically we've got Mercury in Aquarius, quincunx Jupiter in Cancer, and Mercury quincunx Jupiter could be about us thinking about whatever it is we want to say. And there are lots of things we want to say. We want to perhaps be original, but that quincunx to Jupiter might in some cases hold our originality back, or perhaps there is advice there to hold our originality back. We shouldn't feel that we have to be original for the sake of it. I mean, we might say something that is dramatic or sounds dramatic or shows off our brilliance. We might want to do it, might want to say it, but how will other people respond? And Jupiter, I don't know whether we can say it's in Cancer because it's a heliocentric chart, but Jupiter might be the status quo, the tradition, the importance of the tradition. And so Mercury quincunx Jupiter, just because we want to say something doesn't necessarily mean that we should say something. And we have to perhaps understand that some people have their own views and they have a fixed view of the world, and they're not going to appreciate it if someone tries to contradict them. And the restraint of that Mercury quincunx Jupiter, and I think there is a restraint but also perhaps a frustration there as well, is kind of echoed by Venus opposition Saturn. So Venus is moving to that opposition of Saturn. I talked about it yesterday, and it's getting closer and closer. And so Venus opposition Saturn provides some restraint. When we looked at the geocentric picture, I mentioned the Mars trine Saturn, and Mars trine Saturn I will be talking about in greater detail at the end of the video, but Mars trine Saturn indicates restraint. The heliocentric Venus opposition Saturn suggests restraint, holding back on something, perhaps holding back on our emotions, especially in an interpersonal situation. Again, we might like to tell someone how we feel. We might like to get close to someone, but Venus opposition Saturn is saying, well, you've got to hold off. This is not the right time. And it's not just about people, it's about organizations, countries, diplomacy. How do people get on with each other? And with Venus opposition Saturn, there is a limitation there. Venus is also, by the way, making a trine to Uranus. So we've got still got Saturn sextile Uranus, with Venus making the opposition to Saturn, making the trine to Uranus. So over the next day or two, there is maybe a feeling of tension there. We are trying to hold something back, Venus opposition Saturn, but because of the Venus trine Uranus, in the end, we may have a way to express what we've always been trying to express, but we haven't quite been able to get it together. So now it's time to look at things from the viewpoint of the 12 signs. So these are my forecasts for the 12 signs for today, which is Wednesday, October the 29th, 2025. Aries. Things are changing. We have Mercury moving into Sagittarius, and Mercury moving into Sagittarius for you, Aries, I think is a big deal. The reason it's a big deal is because finally you've got a planet in a fire sign, and having a planet in a fire sign, a planet which kind of stays in a fire sign. Mercury is not like the moon that just sort of stays in a sign for a couple of days and just moves on. Mercury will be in Sagittarius, I think, until about November the 19th. Then on November the 19th it goes retrograde and moves back into Scorpio. I think it's November the 19th. But by the time you hit November the 19th, the sun is getting ready to move into Sagittarius. So there is fire now, and you're going to have planets in fire signs, but for quite some time. And from an Aries perspective, that is good, because it means you can be more normal. You can express yourself in a normal Aries way, and so that might be quite liberating. And at the same time, Aries, you can perhaps move into new areas. Perhaps recently you felt rather constrained. You had to deal with what you already knew, and you kind of were wary of moving into any new territory. That was not something you necessarily wanted to do. I mean, you might have kind of liked to move into new territory, but there's always something holding you back. But now that Mercury is moving into Sagittarius, things are changing, and soon enough Mars will be moving into Sagittarius. Next week you'll have Mars moving into Sagittarius. So Aries, things are changing, and if you're feeling at all frustrated today, don't worry. It's nearly over. Perhaps it is over with Mercury moving into Sagittarius. Now, talking about frustration, Mars, your ruler, is making a trine to Saturn, and this trine to Saturn has been building up for some time. And the question is, what exactly does that Mars trine Saturn mean? Now, you could be negative about Mars trine Saturn and say that when Mars is trine Saturn, you're hitting something of a block. You're hitting the limits, and the question is, how far can you really go with it all? And it's possible that there are absolute limits, that if you do take things too far, then you're soon enough going to be pulled back. So that is one way of looking at Mars trine Saturn. But it could be that you're able to be focused. And that's maybe what Saturn is all about. There are things that you are in the process of doing, and you need concentration. You need all the concentration you've got, especially now that Mercury is moving into Sagittarius. Mercury in Sagittarius is not great when it comes to concentration. Mercury in Sagittarius is more, the big picture. Anyway, so Mars trine Saturn can be quite disciplined, and it can be emotionally disciplined. So I do think that things are changing. You are finding it easier to be yourself. But with that Mars trine Saturn, there are still going to be times when you do need focus, when you should be thinking about one thing and really making the very most of it. So I think on balance, that Mars trine Saturn is good for you, especially when you think about it in terms of the overall grand trine. So we've still got Mars trine Jupiter, and we had Mars making an exact trine to Jupiter. Today Mars is making an exact trine to Saturn. So perhaps you're getting the balance right. Mars trine Jupiter is about expansion. Mars trine Saturn is about consolidation and limitation. So maybe you are getting it absolutely right. Another thing one should say about Mars aspecting Jupiter and Saturn, which I think I said yesterday or the day before, is that Jupiter Saturn are very much connected with the way the news unfolds. It is about the wider picture. It's about things happening on the planet, things happening, in the news, happening in different countries. It's about the business cycle. It's about the economy. It's about how society is unfolding. And with Mars hitting Jupiter and Saturn, I think Aries, that you're just very aware of how it's all working, how it's all unfolding. And if you do feel any sense of limitation today, that limitation may not be about you. It's just about your awareness of the world in which you're living. The world is changing. Some things are not as easy as they used to be. On the other hand, it's not all about opportunities being taken from you. It's about new opportunities appearing, and maybe with Mercury moving into Sagittarius, you're able to start to think about those new opportunities over the next few weeks, and that kind of links back to what's happening in society. And it's not that anything happening in society, happening in the world, is good or bad. It's the way it is. It's the way destiny wants it all to unfold. And instead, you should be thinking about how people respond to it. Some people are going to hate it, some people are going to love it, and what you should do is see the problems, be very aware of the problems, but be ready to take advantage of it. And I think that if you can be just open to what's happening around you without being too judgmental, without being too defensive, then I think that this can be really good for you, and it can make you relevant. So if you've in the past thought you're becoming less relevant, a lot of people are worrying about their own relevance with things like AI and technological change and political change as well. Don't worry about it. You can make yourself relevant, and you can really put yourself in the center of things. Taurus, there is a bit of a change going on. I mean, your emphasis is shifting. Perhaps recently, Taurus, you were thinking about possibilities over the last couple of days, maybe. You were aware that there were new possibilities, and you wanted to be experimental, perhaps, and you weren't quite sure where to apply yourself. And you were afraid, perhaps, that if you were to apply yourself in one direction, then you might upset someone, or you were thinking about the social side of things, possibly more than you should have been, and perhaps you were being ever so slightly self-conscious. But things are changing, and at the moment, we've got the moon making a conjunction to Pluto, the moon in Aquarius making a conjunction to Pluto. So moon goes into Aquarius today. And what this means for you, you Taurus, is that, you have a chance to, think again about what you would like to be doing. The moon making a conjunction to Pluto, making a trine to Uranus. It gives you a chance to perhaps be original and to appreciate what makes you special, what makes you different, and additionally making sure that you are rewarded for it. Rewards do matter. And so if you've been planning on getting something off the ground, starting something, but you really hadn't really known how to go about it, it's now becoming quite clear. And so if you have any targets or aims, something you really want to achieve, now is the time to do it, and to do it in your own way. originality matters. It's not a time, no longer a time, to be worrying about what other people think. You don't want to upset anyone. Not anymore. It is a time to be yourself and to be original and to have perhaps an unusual way of looking at things. You have permission to do that, and part of a reason for that is that Mercury is changing sign. You did have Mercury moving through Scorpio, Mercury moving through your opposite sign, and so while Mercury was moving through Scorpio, every now and then you had to worry and think about what other people wanted, especially as the Sun and Mars were also in Scorpio. But now that Mercury has changed sign, you can change your approach. You can look at things maybe sort of more deeply, and when you look at things more deeply, you realize it's not just about other people and what other people want. And so feel free to be original, but also be aware of what's going on around you. That is important. Mars is making a trine to Saturn. It's also making a trine to Jupiter, so we've got this grand trine. And this grand trine is arguably quite sociable. I mean, it is about other people, but at the same time, you're in a situation where you need to think about yourself, and you need to be original. So how do you balance that? Well, you should regard other people as being there for you, and they have something to offer, something constructive to offer. They're not telling you what to do. They're not disrupting your plans. They're not trying to sort of force you to do things according to a particular system. They are available, and perhaps Mars trine Saturn might represent a person who could be, in their own way, quite disciplined. That this person does have focus, and it's a focus that perhaps you can benefit from. So if you have an idea, you want to be original, you want to do something different, you don't necessarily have to do it completely on your own. You can get help, but the help has to come in the right way. It is absolutely not about being overwhelmed by another person with a strong personality. I mean, there are people there around with a strong personality that perhaps represents Mars in Scorpio, trine Jupiter and Saturn. But you have to think about yourself, your own agenda, and your own, not just agenda, it goes further than that, your own priorities and even your own destiny. That's what matters. And you require respect and advice. I mean, advice, there's nothing wrong with getting advice. There's nothing wrong with being told that you're perhaps taking an approach which needs to be fine-tuned. But fundamentally, Taurus, deep down, you do know what you're doing, but it's just the things on the edges, the precise way in which you execute a plan could perhaps be improved, and maybe there are people around you who can be of help. Now, as far as relationships are concerned, perhaps close relationships, maybe the Mars trine Saturn needs to be considered. And Mars trine Saturn suggests that partners and other people close to you should not be underestimated. They do have a clear view of the way things should be done, and maybe they understand things that you don't. You might know generally where things are going, but in terms of relationships, you shouldn't just discount what another person says or discount another person's approach, because that Mars is quite overwhelming at the moment. But still, you've got to keep in mind that you've got to hold on to yourself and your originality, and do whatever is most important to you. You've got to do it, but at the same time, you shouldn't discount other people. You shouldn't discount other people's feelings as well. Again, it goes back to that Mars trine Saturn, Mars trine Jupiter. So it could be quite a complicated day when you've got to keep two principles in mind, two principles which may be very different from one another. There is the principle of your autonomy, and that really matters. But there's also the principle that there are some people who are very strongly placed and they can't be neglected, but you can't be obsessed by them. You don't want a situation where strong-minded people restrict you and prevent you from doing what's really important to you. But if you hold that in mind and you do concentrate on what is important, I think you'll be able to get through the day, and the day should be a valuable building block for the future, maybe even a sort of a first start, a first step. Gemini. There are certainly things going on, things affecting you. And when we talk about Gemini, we're talking about Mercury very often, because Mercury is your ruler. And Mercury, your ruler, is moving into Sagittarius. And I think it stays in Sagittarius until November the 19th. So what's going on with Mercury is that Mercury is starting to slow down. In the end, it will go retrograde. In fact, when does Mercury go retrograde? So Mercury goes retrograde around the 10th, in about 10 days' time. No, more than that. More like a 12 days' time, whatever. But Mercury is kind of getting ready to go retrograde because its movement, it's going slower and slower, and perhaps you're starting to give yourself time to understand things and to understand where things are going. And then now, well, today, Mercury is moving into Sagittarius. So it's true that Mercury is slowing down, but then Mercury moving into Sagittarius, that's a complete change of emphasis. And Mercury's been in a water sign, it's been in Scorpio, and now it's in a fire sign. So it could be that the whole way you present yourself, is changing. And Mercury in Sagittarius, okay, it sounds exciting, doesn't it? Mercury moving into a fire sign, but you shouldn't forget that Mercury is in its detriment in Sagittarius. So while Mercury is in Sagittarius between now and I think November the 19th, because on the 19th it retrogrades back into Scorpio. So over the next 3 weeks or so, it really does matter that you try to think things through. You don't get caught up in the tide of things, and there is this tide with Mercury and Sagittarius. People can get excited about things. You can get excited about things, and you lose touch with reality. That's how Mercury and Sagittarius can work. Or you build wonderful concepts, the wonderful theories about the way things are, which essentially are based on nothing. So if you start to have strong ideas over the next few weeks, don't take them too seriously. You might also get spiritual ideas. You might think that you're in touch with something wonderful, Mercury and Sagittarius, but again, it might be nothing. So be realistic. And also with Mercury and Sagittarius, it does have an impact on relationships. Because really, the Sagittarius season is starting, kind of, because Mercury is about to move into, is moving into Sagittarius. Mars is going to move into Sagittarius next week. And of course, at the end of November, the Sun moves into Sagittarius. So when you have all this stuff going into Sagittarius, you immediately think of other people, of relationships, and how these relationships are faring, and you perhaps have to give consideration to other people. That may not be something you necessarily want to do. But with Mercury moving into Sagittarius, that may say something about your relationship to other people. And it could be that we could interpret Mercury in Sagittarius as moving into a situation which is overly dependent. I mean, if you want to be really symbolic about it, you could say Mercury moving into Sagittarius is about you moving into another person's territory. You know, it's not your rules anymore. The signs have changed. The language has changed. It's like kind of moving. You're driving on the left, and then you move across the border, and then you suddenly find you have to drive on the right. So that could be how you experience Mercury moving into Sagittarius. Okay, not as dramatically as that, but just consider the possibility that as far as power is concerned, some of that power is shifting, and it may be moving away from you. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. You know, sometimes you have to let other people take the initiative, and you have to do things in other people's way. You might think you know best, but that's not necessarily the case. And Mercury, while it moves through Sagittarius, is making some quite important aspects. It's making opposition to Uranus. It's making it's making a sextile to Neptune. Well, it makes a sextile to Neptune before it moves into Sagittarius in late Scorpio. But I think the Mercury opposition Uranus is a particularly important aspect. Sorry, did I say Mercury sextile Neptune? Sorry, let me get this straight. I said moon is sextile Neptune. Mercury is trine Neptune. Let me get that right. And that Mercury trine Neptune does matter. Even after Mercury has moved into Sagittarius, it's still trine Neptune. So how would you see Mercury trine Neptune? Well, Mercury trine Neptune, that could be an aspect which is on one level quite spiritual. Neptune represents something that is otherworldly, going sort of beyond your normal existence. So Mercury trine Neptune could be strange coincidences, things happening which seem to indicate that weird forces are at work. Mercury trine Neptune might allow you to get in touch with something beyond yourself. So that's good. And it's also perhaps good from a psychic perspective. Is Gemini a particularly psychic sign? I mean, I would not have regarded myself as being a psychic. Sometimes I'm as psychic as a brick wall. But if you do have any psychic abilities, or should I say perhaps psychic pretensions, I mean, we all have psychic pretensions in this world. I mean, why am I into astrology? I mean, I think anyone who gets into astrology perhaps starts by being interested in the supernatural and with telepathy and things like that. So there is always going to be an interest in psychic ability. And so Mercury trine Neptune, yeah, it can be psychic pretensions. And I kind of mean that seriously. With Mercury trine Neptune, there can be a lot of information coming our way, and we might like to read it in a particular way, which is very nice, but we can delude ourselves. Now, Gemini is a sign, perhaps it doesn't delude itself that often. Its delusions are perhaps relate to ideas rather than feelings. But Mercury trine Neptune, you might get a feeling about something, and that feeling, could be misplaced, or maybe you're over-interpreting it. You perhaps you pick up a lot of feelings when the feelings themselves are real, but your interpretation could be all wrong. So if you find yourself reaching a conclusion, particularly if that conclusion is vague and is not based on anything real and tangible, then it's quite possible that conclusion is just up the creek. You have got something wrong. So that is possible. Remember, I've got my sun in Gemini, so I could very well be deluding myself. And so maybe with Mercury trine Neptune, you shouldn't listen to me too much over the next couple of days. Maybe I've got things wrong. Maybe I'm sort of misunderstanding the planets. Maybe I'm reading too much into things. So that is an important aspect, and it's also important the fact that Mercury is opposition Uranus. Mercury opposition Uranus across the main the main axis of your chart. So this is a reminder that Uranus is in your sign. Obviously, Uranus has been moving through your sign. It will soon go back into Taurus. Very soon, something like November the 8th or so. So enjoy Uranus in Gemini while you can. And so Mercury in opposition Uranus, you could say that that is kind of one of the last chances to make the most of Uranus in Gemini until next year. And Mercury opposition Uranus could be about your originality, wanting to do something different. And Mercury opposition Uranus is a challenge. Now, you want to do something different, perhaps, and the consequences of your decisions are made clear, perhaps by another person's reaction to you. So that's one way of looking at it. Also, Gemini, you might think that you have got all the answers, that originality comes from you. You're the original person. You have the ideas. But maybe originality often starts somewhere else. And that may be the Mercury opposition Uranus. It's possible that you notice someone else doing something unusual, doing something that might be very sort of forward thinking. And just because it's someone else's idea doesn't mean it should be discarded. So consider the possibility that your originality can have its roots in what another person is doing. You realize that someone else has a rather interesting way of looking at the world, or perhaps they're doing something you have never seen someone do before, and perhaps you want a part of that. So that Mercury opposition Uranus could be very, very constructive. I mean, there is, of course, a negative side to Mercury opposition Uranus. I mean, we could just see it as being hasty, accident-prone. Mercury in Sagittarius opposition Uranus. You might just say something that you regret, and you want to be different. You want to stand out, and you say something, and immediately you have to deal with the consequences. But maybe the consequences, won't be so bad. Maybe you want to stir things up. So Gemini, do make the most of today. There's a lot going on today. I mean, it's a very busy day, and also Moon is moving into Aquarius. So Moon moving into Aquarius highlights your originality and the fact that you can be different. And the question is, how are you going to be different? So that's perhaps a question for you over the course of the day. Cancer. You don't have to worry so much about other people and what they're doing, and if you want to ignore someone, perhaps someone who is doing something you don't like, or you don't approve of, or you're just not interested, I think you can. And if you want to keep your own counsel, then go ahead. There's no reason why you have to be bothered. Instead, Cancer, you just might want to concentrate on your own material and on your own relationship to the cosmos. The Moon is now moving into Aquarius. It makes a conjunction to Pluto. It makes a trine to Uranus. It's also, it makes a sextile to Neptune just before it moves into Aquarius. But I think that the fact that the Moon is conjunct Pluto, trine Uranus, you're picking up on a new energy, and it's quite a positive energy, and you're aware that the universe is telling you stuff, and you perhaps don't want to discuss it, and that might relate to the Moon conjunct Pluto. When the Moon is conjunct Moon and Pluto conjunct in Aquarius, Cancer, you're aware that some things are quite heavy, and they do need to be treated with respect. And so if you want to be treated with respect, then you have to be careful and be cautious. So there is a sense of caution here, and that's fine. But maybe you don't want to exaggerate, because there are other things going on. Specifically, there is a grand trine in water signs. It's ongoing grand trine in water signs. And we've got Mars making a trine to Jupiter and making a trine to Saturn. And so, in spite of all your caution, you do need to be aware of what this grand trine is about. Now, this grand trine, I think, is pretty fortunate. I talked about Mars trine Jupiter yesterday. With Mars trine Jupiter, that is a great aspect, and Mars is still trine Jupiter. Mars in Scorpio, trine Jupiter in Cancer. Mars is in its own sign. Jupiter is in your sign. Jupiter is exalted in your sign. So that gives you a lot of energy. I mean, you might be cautious. You might feel that it's a dangerous world, but you've still got a lot of energy, and you've got a lot of enthusiasm and optimism. So, yeah, you might be wary. You might know that there are many pitfalls out there, but fundamentally you are optimistic. But of course, optimism on its own doesn't lead anywhere. Optimism can naturally fade into disappointment if you don't see it through. But I think you can see it through, because Mars isn't just trine Jupiter, it's trine Saturn. And you could say that Mars trine Saturn allows you to create some discipline, create some stability. So, you have perhaps wonderful ideas, you are optimistic about something, and then Saturn is telling you what you need to do to make it permanent, to fix it, to make it a part of your life. So that Mars trine Saturn, which we have today, I think is something, something very positive, and perhaps what allows you to see something through is to perceive it as part of your wider destiny, and maybe that's how you do it. So, I mean, I'm not a Cancerian, but just to give you an example, I've been doing these YouTube videos, God, for nearly 3 years, and doing a video every day. It's kind of quite a commitment. But why? How do I keep going? I mean, maybe it's just persistence with Taurus, my Taurus rising, which just keeps going. But maybe it's because I see it as part of my destiny. And if you think that something is part of your destiny, this is something I should be doing for whatever reason, then you have to keep going, or you should keep going, because if you go against your destiny, you're in trouble. So I don't want to project my own material onto you, particularly as I'm not a Cancerian. But the idea is that if you are doing something that is important to you, it really feels that it matters. Why do you keep going with it? Why don't you just stop? Why don't you just get bored? Well, one reason might be because you can start to see things on a wider level, a higher level. Where are you right now? When I say where are you in terms of the sort of unfolding of your life? Destiny comes in waves. There are times in your life where you've got particular things to do, where it's very much your destiny to do something, and that time of your life lasts not necessarily forever. It might just be a few years where you've got to do something. And with you, if you can actually see the broader view, and if you can understand that things you're doing right now that feel good, that you feel excited about, you feel optimistic about them, what stops them just being a flash in the pan is your awareness that they are part of a whole, that perhaps for the next few years, this is what you're supposed to be doing. And if you're not doing it, well, you're doing something wrong as far as your broad destiny is concerned. So if you are enthusiastic about something and you feel an underlying optimism, but also the question, will you be able to carry on with it? It's all very well being optimistic about something, believing that something will work, but how's that going to unfold? You might hit a temporary obstacle and give up on it. You might not get enough enthusiasm, give up on it, but you won't give up on it if you just know that it is, part of, who you are. And in the process, I think, Cancer, that you're going to get quite a lot of support from the right areas. Different people have different views, and I think that with Mars trine Saturn, the right person can be very, very supportive. Okay, the wrong person can just lead you astray, but you know that there are people out there who are wise and considered. Perhaps in some respects they know more than you, or perhaps have more experience than you, or wiser than you, maybe, at least in a temporary sense. And so you can trust them to give you the support you need. I mean, not that you need any support, but if you feel you need some encouragement, then I think that encouragement will be available. Leo, it's good that Mercury is moving into Sagittarius. I think that we've had 3 planets in Scorpio for some time. Sun, Mercury, Mars in Scorpio. And from a Leo perspective, I think it was too much of a good thing. I think it was just getting a bit excessive. With all those planets in Scorpio, you just might have found that you were just too focused on yourself and your immediate surroundings, and you maybe also felt that you couldn't take risks. You perhaps couldn't do anything that was wildly different. But now that the Mercury is moving into Sagittarius, you feel that there are new opportunities. Things aren't so boring, and you're able to perhaps take a few steps outside your immediate zone of influence. Yeah, that might represent a risk, but I think it's going to be okay. And it's also a reminder that things are about to change. Mars, you've still got Mars in Scorpio. Next week Mars moves into Sagittarius, so you're going to have Mercury and Mars in Sagittarius. Okay, the Sun won't move into Sagittarius for a few more weeks, but it's a reminder that things are changing. And with Mercury moving into a fire sign, you probably feel more inspired now. And as the sign change takes place, okay, Mercury will move into Sagittarius at different times for different people. I mean, in London, Mercury moves into Sagittarius at 11 in the morning. So if you're in Australia, it won't be until this evening Mercury moves into Sagittarius. But in the Americas, it's early in the morning that the sign change takes place, very early in the morning before dawn. So if you're an American Leo, is there. Mercury's in Sagittarius, there's stuff in a fire sign. And that's perhaps the point. It's having something in a fire sign which allows you to sort of get things together and start to be aware of what you can do as an individual. And perhaps you had doubts recently. You thought you couldn't do things. That creatively you were perhaps a little bit stuck. But now Mercury's moving into Sagittarius. I think that stuckness is very much going. Things are starting to move. And also, we have got the moon moving out of Capricorn into Aquarius. So, with the moon is now in your opposite sign, and that means that you can start to consider alternative viewpoints, other people. What are other people thinking? Take an interest in them. It might not be your first impulse, but they do have something to offer, and particularly as you are, I hope, trying to spread your wings more. You're trying to sort of move out of one place, experiment, and so that is I think positive. And perhaps you need an alternative view, and the moon is making a conjunction to Pluto. It's making a trine to Uranus, and so you definitely do get that alternative view. And when you get an alternative view, you can respond to it in a positive way. Perhaps in the past you were trying to restrict yourself. You did not want things to be stirred up by other people, other situations that you didn't fully understand, that you didn't really want to be bothered with. It seemed risky, it seemed dangerous, but now things are changing. I mean, you still have a stubbornness to you. You're still pretty focused on what is important to you. The sun is still in Scorpio, so we know with the sun in Scorpio, it is a time of year when many Leos want to hold firm, and that's good. I mean, you need some stability, and so perhaps if you remind yourself that the sun is in Scorpio, that fundamentally you do have that stability, so that allows you to take some risks. It allows you to experiment. It allows you to do things that you haven't perhaps done before, and perhaps you can risk making a fool of yourself. That is a risk that we often have to take. Some people never want to make a fool of themselves, and in the process something just gets inhibited. But you've got to try something. See what happens. What's the worst that can happen? Well, your worst that can happen is often that you make a fool of yourself, and that doesn't work. But and you move on to something else. So the overall message today, Leo, is to start to be more adventurous and realize that things are changing, and things are changing for the better. And now that Mercury is moving into Sagittarius, at the very least there's some fire, there's some inspiration here, and so Leo, really try to take advantage of it. Virgo, we have Mercury changing sign, and Mercury is of course your ruler, and so with Mercury changing sign, okay, in one sense it's Mercury moving into Sagittarius. You think that this is a time when you are going to be more verbal in some respects. I mean, I think you've been quite verbal recently. You've been quite capable of communicating, telling people what's on your mind, and perhaps being able to stir things up a bit with Mercury moving through Scorpio. But now Mercury is moving into Sagittarius. It's a kind of quite contradictory picture. On one hand, you can be in your own way more outrageous and more outspoken. That is the nature of Mercury in Sagittarius. But on the other hand, it's all about you. The reason you might be outspoken is perhaps because you're being defensive. You're developing a new defensiveness, and it's not a bad thing. There are times when you do have to think about what is important, and if you sort of spend more time, for example, somewhere safe, perhaps in your home, somewhere where you just trust everyone, you trust everything around you. So if you're becoming more defensive, you have to think, what are the function of words? Well, the function of words might be to protect yourself. If people are coming too close, you know how to put them off, perhaps. You say something quite outrageous, for example, and at an unconscious level, you might be trying to scare people away. And Virgos can be very verbal, and they can say things which are outrageous, which are maybe offensive. Now, these are not words you normally associate with Virgo. Virgos are supposed to be careful and cautious, but they can sting. Every Virgo has the capability of stinging if they feel it's necessary. And perhaps this is what Mercury moving into Sagittarius is all about. So it's not a normal Mercury and Sagittarius experience if you are a Virgo. And also, Virgo, remember that Mercury is in its detriment when it's moving through Sagittarius. It's not a great sign for Mercury to be in. And it's possible, Virgo, that you reach some uncharacteristic conclusions. I mean, I know Mercury moves into Sagittarius every year, so it's not a particularly rare event. But when Mercury is moving into Sagittarius, you can reach conclusions which may not be right. The reason you reach these conclusions is because you want to reach a conclusion. You don't want to sort of have to worry about the details of a matter forever. I mean, of course, you're in some respects a details person, but details, it can just get a bit boring, and you just like to wrap it all up and just get the answers done and not worry too much about how you got to the answers. So if you do find yourself reaching conclusions over the next couple of weeks, perhaps you need to rethink, because maybe you've got it wrong. You've just been in too much of a hurry to sort things out intellectually. And Mercury is also making an opposition to Uranus. Okay, and not just today, but sort of tomorrow as well. We've got Mercury opposition Uranus, and okay, that might say something about what you say, and certainly Virgos, as I've already said, can be quite verbal, and you might say things that you do regret, or it could be ideas. I mean, that's another way of looking at it. You might have sudden conclusions that just come from nowhere, and you think you've got it all sorted out, and it's very sudden, and there could be an excitement about it. And it's good to be excited, but if you find yourself getting very excited, feeling that you've just solved something, then maybe not. Maybe you haven't solved it, but you certainly think you've solved it. And that might then suggest that you need more work. I mean, it's good to think that you've solved something, provided you realize you haven't necessarily solved it. That's like the first stage of dealing with a problem. Very often when you're trying to deal with a problem, your first impulse is to want to solve it quickly. You think you've solved it quickly, but then you have to look at it again and again, and then you realize it's a more complicated process. It will take time to deal with, and so that's one thing. I mean, it is a lot to do with Mercury, what's going on today, and Mercury is also trine Neptune. So this trine between Mercury and Neptune, the exact trine is Mercury in very, very late Scorpio, trine Neptune in very, very late Pisces. But even when Mercury moves into Sagittarius, it's still making a trine to Neptune. So with Mercury trine Neptune, that could give you enhanced sensitivity. Mercury trine Neptune, or indeed Mercury Neptune aspects in general, are often connected with spirituality, with maybe one's psychic abilities. That is a possibility, and with connections with something that is completely beyond you. And you are making that connection. And so Mercury trine Neptune, it does make you more sensitive, perhaps gives you enhanced sort of telepathic abilities, but it is a trine between Mercury and Neptune. When we talk about trines, we're talking about something that is easy. It's very easy to be sensitive. It's very easy to be oversensitive. And so Mercury trine Neptune could be overwhelming. So you are at the receiving end of just a huge amount of inputs. And then the moment Mercury moves into Sagittarius, still making a trine to Neptune, you're thinking, okay, there's a lot of information coming in. let's just sort it all out. Let's rationalize it all and let's jump to a conclusion. And that is not the right thing to do. As I think I've already said over the course of this piece on Virgos, you instead have to just recognize that there is a lot of information coming in. There's a lot of stuff to sort out, and it could just take some time. Libra. Moon is moving into Aquarius, and Moon moving into Aquarius, if you're a Libran, that's good, isn't it? I mean, the Moon is moving into an air sign, and when the Moon moves into Aquarius, it makes a conjunction to Pluto, and it makes a trine to Venus. So Libra, I think there is a change. I think that it is a change for the better. Things are becoming perhaps less complicated. Things have been a bit complicated recently. It's not just your own complications. It's other people's complicated lives. It's other people, getting worried about their own priorities, and that there's perhaps been an emotionality around which you haven't always felt comfortable with. But with Moon moving into Aquarius, Moon making that conjunction to Pluto, you can start to get some perspective, and your ideas will start flowing. And it's not just about conjunction to Pluto, it's also about the trine to Uranus. So Libra, be happy that things are changing, and that things are changing for the better. And also, Libra, you can perhaps be freer in terms of what you say. You perhaps have held things back in a way that wasn't particularly desirable, and you might have got annoyed about it, having to try so hard to make other people happy, or perhaps it wasn't just about making them happy, but try so hard to worry about particular details, maybe of a financial nature. They could have got you down, and it was just a lot to take on. But now that Mercury is moving into Sagittarius, you can be freer. You can say what's on your mind, and Librans can be very effective communicators. They can really get to the point. They can kind of tell people what they are thinking, and their observations are not always welcome. But you see, Librans have a good understanding of social dynamics, and with Mercury opposition Uranus, you could say that your ability to communicate is going to be, particularly powerful over the next couple of days. And if you want to stir things up for whatever reason with Mercury opposition Uranus, I think you very much can. You can get people to take notice of you. So don't worry about being ignored. Though Libra, you've got to make some effort to choose your words carefully, because Mercury, while it's good that Mercury is moving into Sagittarius, I mean it feels a bit of a relief, having Mercury in a fire sign, and it's a very free-flowing place for Mercury to be. The problem is that you just might say something without fully thinking it through, and if you don't think something through, Libra, then there could be problems, and you might be surprisingly outrageous. And Librans can be outrageous because Librans do understand the way the balance works, and they know that there are always ways of upsetting the balance. And if you upset the balance, well, you have to start afresh. Maybe you want to upset the balance, and that's certainly something you can do with Mercury making an opposition to Uranus. But don't worry too much about other people and what they're doing. Perhaps what matters is you, and you doing something that is genuinely original. And perhaps that relates to the fact that the Moon is making a conjunction to Pluto. It is a time for Librans to be creative, to be original, to not worry too much about what other people are thinking, Because if you worry about what other people are thinking, you can't be original, and whatever you're producing is going to be derivative, and that's absolutely not what you want to happen. But I'm not suggesting, though, that you are completely vague, that it's all sort of pie in the sky. It's not. And one thing we do have today is a grand trine in water signs, and this grand trine in water signs, it does affect everyone. It affects all the 12 signs, but it affects the 12 signs in different ways. And what this grand trine in water signs does is it emphasizes the fact that Jupiter's in Cancer. And Jupiter has been in Cancer for a long time, since the early summer. And for you, Jupiter in Cancer is about ambition. It's about thinking about everything that you want to do, things that are important, and you have a chance to be successful, in your own terms. But sometimes you forget that Jupiter is in Cancer. There may be times when you feel you're not being successful, when you feel that things aren't working out, and that can be frustrating. But this grand trine with Mars we had a Mars trine Jupiter yesterday. We've got Mars trine Saturn today. I think that really is great. It does allow you to apply yourself and to think about what is important to you. And if something is important to you, then it's absolutely essential that you give it your best shot. And remember, that Mars trine Saturn, which we have today, Saturn is in mutual reception to Venus. Venus and Saturn are in each other's exaltation. And so I think that should be really helpful. And with Mars making the trine to Saturn, that indicates that through your own hard work, you can really get some really effective results, and you can get recognition, and perhaps most importantly, you can get rewarded. So I really use this grand trine. I think for you certainly it's very positive. So what is it that you want? What do you want to get together? And I think that you can really be effective about it. And also Mars is involved, and so maybe Libra, you don't have to do everything on your own, because Mars is ruler of Aries. It's ruler of your opposite sign. So you're trying to create something. You're trying to create an effect. You should be trying to create an effect. You can bring other people in, and that might mean, Libra, that you're in a much stronger position than you realize. And it doesn't take much to get things moving. Things can move very, very quickly and naturally. It's not forced. And one thing just naturally flows into another, and in the end it all works your way. So do make the most of what's happening today, because not just today, but over the next day or two, certainly while this grand trine is in action, because I do think that it can be for you very fortunate. Scorpio, there's quite a lot going on today. For everyone, and certainly for you. The big aspect is Mars trine Saturn, my headline aspect, and at the end of this video I'll be talking about this aspect in some detail. So the question is, this Mars trine Saturn, is it a good aspect or is it bad? When you hear trine, you think, oh, maybe that's a good aspect, because traditionally trines are regarded as being fortunate. And one way of looking at Mars trine Saturn is about discipline. Your Mars is in Scorpio. Mars is your ruler. If it's trine Saturn, that might mean that you're able to get yourself together, in quite a big way, and it allows you to organize yourself, and perhaps you've got ideas and plans that you want to bring to fruition, but you've maybe been a little bit chaotic about it, and Mars trine Saturn can allow you to do what is necessary to make sure that the details are all sorted out. I mean, that's one way of looking at Mars trine Saturn. Another way of looking at Mars trine Saturn is to say, well, yeah, it's a trine, but it's just another aspect. And is a trine so different from a square? It's just a contact. And so with Mars trine Saturn, there is a possibility over the course of the day that you feel quite sort of blocked, sort of frustrated, that things really aren't moving. Now, why would that be the case? It would be the case if you were doing something that is just not right. If you're doing something that you shouldn't be doing. When I say shouldn't be doing, I'm talking about your overall self. We all have our purpose. If something is in accord with your purpose and you do it, you'll be fine. But if you do something which is contrary to your purpose, it's not going to work. And so that might be the test. If you do something and it's easy and it all comes together, then that's a sign that you're doing the right thing. If you're doing something and it's really difficult and you're going nowhere and you're feeling completely frustrated, perhaps you're doing it out of a sense of blind obligation, in that case, yeah, you're going to feel bad. And that's perhaps a sign that you should just switch tasks. Find the thing that you regard as being most satisfactory and being most important to you. And in that sense, the Mars trine Saturn can work very well. And of course, it's not just Mars trine Saturn, it's Mars is making a trine to Jupiter as well. So we've got a grand trine in water signs. And so this grand trine in water signs, if you use it properly, if you do what is in accord with your fundamental purpose, then I don't really see how things can go wrong. And it can be just a day where you can accomplish a huge amount in a very short period of time. So you can see the contradiction, or not the contradiction, or the way in which it can be two very different days. You could achieve absolutely nothing if you're doing the wrong thing. You are acting out of obligation, or I don't know, you've just got things wrong. You haven't really asked yourself the right questions. But if you're doing the right thing, things will move very, very quickly. Now, another thing about this Mars trine Saturn, which I probably should have talked about in the introduction, I mean, I'll mention it at the end of the video, is the fact that Saturn is in mutual reception by exaltation with Venus. So Venus and Saturn, in a way, kind of switch places. I mean, I know that's a bit controversial in astrology, but you could, some astrologers might argue that. So when Mars is trine Saturn, you could say it's almost trine Venus as well, because Venus and Saturn are in mutual reception, by exaltation. And so that might mean that the Mars trine Saturn could have a surprisingly social dimension. And it could be about other people, it could be about relationships. And so from a relationship perspective, this Mars trine Saturn could really allow you to get on with someone very well, and almost to realize that you and someone else are sort of meant for each other. I mean, by meant for each other, it can be something very short term. It might be that right now you need to have someone in your life, or right now you need to get help from someone. Maybe you and someone else can help each other in terms of a particular task. So you don't have to treat it as being too dramatic when I say that you and someone else might be meant for each other. You might be meant for each other today or this week. Maybe you're not meant for each other next week. But that does indicate a powerful connection, perhaps a powerful creative connection that you can have with another person. I mean, it could be a romantic connection. It kind of depends on the situation. But, that's another reason to think that Mars trine Saturn, it can be a very fortunate aspect. And so that's something to think about. I hope you have a good day. I mean, you really should have a good day, and that you really are able to, make the most of everything. And another thing going on is that, we've had a lot of planets in Scorpio. We've had, well, when the moon was in Scorpio not so long ago, we had 4 planets in Scorpio. But now Mercury is leaving Scorpio, and it's moving into Sagittarius. And perhaps this is a reminder that the Scorpio emphasis that you've been experiencing is not going to last forever. You've had Mars in Scorpio for some time, and Mars next week leaves Scorpio. And that's a shame. Mars in Scorpio, in its own sign, is very strong, and that should really help you achieve whatever it is you want to achieve. But next week when it moves into Sagittarius, I'm afraid it does lose some of its strength, and you perhaps have to wait for it to get into Capricorn, because when Mars moves into Capricorn, I don't know, in a few months' time, it will be back in its exaltation. But Mercury now is moving out of Scorpio. So some of that Scorpio emphasis is going, and when Mercury moves into Sagittarius, as it does today, 11:02 a.m. London time, so much earlier if you're in the Americas, this evening if you're in Australia or New Zealand. But when Mercury moves into Sagittarius, perhaps there'll be things that you start thinking about that you weren't thinking about before. Mercury in Sagittarius might mean that you suddenly start to think about money, or something you own or think you'd like to own. And Mercury, when it does move into Sagittarius, it makes an opposition to Uranus. So that Mercury opposition Uranus, which is around today and tomorrow, and probably later, perhaps it's certainly a feature of this sort of mid to late week, Mercury opposition Uranus, could be that you suddenly start to think about money in a new way. Perhaps you hadn't thought that money was important, and now you suddenly realize, actually money is important and you need to do something about it. And so if you're feeling any concerns about money, or any feelings of financial urgency or growing urgency, then with Mercury opposition Uranus, maybe you should do something about it. Mercury opposition Uranus might additionally represent a realization about money. You had perhaps been oblivious to something, or you'd kind of known about it, but you weren't really thinking about it. And then suddenly you think, hold on, this is really important. You've got to do something about it. So that might be a way in which the Mercury-Uranus opposition manifests. Sagittarius. Mercury is moving into your sign. And this is perhaps the first sign that the Sagittarius season is about to start. Okay, it doesn't start for a bit of time. I mean, the sun doesn't go into Sagittarius until the end of November. But, the Mercury hugs the sun. Mercury is not far away from the sun. And so in this case, Mercury is ahead of the sun. And so it's kind of like a bit of a pathfinder. And so Mercury is moving into Sagittarius. And next week, Mars moves into Sagittarius. And so you're getting planets in fire signs, those elusive fire signs. There's been this terrible lack of fire, but now that problem is over with Mercury being in Sagittarius. Now Mercury doesn't stay in Sagittarius forever. I think on around November the 19th, Mercury moves back into Scorpio, but by that time Mars will be in Sagittarius. So things are changing. And the Sagittarius season is very close, which kind of tells us, soon enough it's going to be Christmas, isn't it? Time flies. And so I think that you are feeling better. There have been moments where you haven't been feeling great, where you haven't been feeling particularly Sagittarian. You've sometimes had to sort of hide your light, and you weren't able to reveal your true self. But now with Mercury in Sagittarius, you can be sort of more sort of free flowing, and you're helped by the fact that the moon is moving into Aquarius. Aquarius is a sign that has considerable sympathy with Sagittarius. Those two signs understand each other. When the moon is in Sagittarius, you know what to do, you know how to communicate, you know what to say. And there is a lot to be said. And it could be, Sagittarius, that you feel that you've kept quiet about a number of things, and you know that you can't keep quiet forever. It doesn't even suit you being too quiet. And now the words start to flow. Now, when the words start to flow, in one sense, that's good. I mean, you don't want to repress things. But on the other hand, you have to think about what kind of impact your words are having. Sagittarians can be tactless, and sometimes the things that Sagittarians say can cause offense, even considerable offense. So don't feel that you have to say it all at once, and try, if possible, to use your sensitivity. You haven't lost your sensitivity, by the way. You've still got Jupiter in Cancer. Jupiter's going to be in Cancer until next summer. So Jupiter in Cancer does give you sensitivity, and also Jupiter is trine Saturn. So that trine Saturn at the moment is providing a certain amount of discipline. So I think you can be disciplined, but at the same time you can be free and open. And one aspect that we do have that perhaps needs some attention is an opposition aspect between Mercury and Uranus. So what happens is that Mercury moves into Sagittarius, and then over the next couple of days it's in opposition to Uranus. In that Mercury opposition Uranus, is across the main axis of your chart, and it is about what you say, and it is a reminder that what I've just said. You've held things back, and now perhaps the dam is open. You just can't help yourself. So there is a lot you want to say, and you may get a reaction with Mercury opposition Uranus. The words you choose might still be in their own way, quite radical. I mean, yes, you have some discipline with Jupiter trine Saturn, but maybe the discipline means you're going to be knowing what you're doing. You perhaps will know that you're causing a stir by the things you say with Mercury opposition Uranus. But maybe there's another way of looking at Mercury opposition Uranus. When we're talking about the Sagittarius Gemini axis, you've got Uranus is in Gemini, it is your opposite sign, and so it's possible that someone does something or says something that you hadn't expected, and straight away it seems almost that things change radically. It changes everything. So be ready to hear something or see something in terms of another person that you just hadn't realized, you hadn't really thought about, and you have that realization, and then the question is, how do you respond? And what you're being reminded of is your own need for change, and you perhaps have got a little bit stuck in where you are, and you're looking for change, and change can come from many places, and change can come from another person, and perhaps it's another person who does something that initiates the change within you. And I mean, it's a process that is good, but short term it might feel ever so slightly disturbing, and the question is, who is disturbing who? I mean, you're quite capable of causing disturbances, but it can work both ways. Capricorn. Possibly things are slowing down in some respects. You'd like things to slow down at least. You know that you've got your own priorities that perhaps you hadn't given enough time to, and now you're making an assessment of the world in which is quite realistic, and you know what you have, you know what you don't have, and you can be very clear about this. And part of this is caused by the fact that the moon is moving into Aquarius, and when the moon moves into Aquarius, it makes a conjunction to Pluto. So moon conjunct Pluto can be a conjunction which is quite obsessive. You know what's important, and you're not going to forget it. And that moon conjunct Pluto could be about money. You feeling that you have to get hold of something, and the question is, how do you get hold of it? Or it could also be that you want to keep hold of it. Perhaps something of a material nature. You feel it's threatened, but you have to keep hold of it with everything you've got. But this is something passing, and I don't think it's really the main issue today. Probably the main issue today is the fact that Mars is making a trine to Saturn, and Mars trine Saturn is directly relevant to you, because Saturn is your ruling planet. So if Mars is making a trine to Saturn, this could be energizing. And part of you wants probably to have a low profile, an easy day. You don't want any trouble. But Mars trine Saturn indicates that in reality you have got a huge amount of energy. It's all available to you, and you can quite possibly be energized by other people. You can pick up on their energy. So if you're feeling a bit listless, you don't really feel like doing anything, maybe that's just because you're alone. And as soon as you start to interact with anyone, whether it's face to face or online or whatever, that provides you with the motivation that I think you need. And I think you do need it. I mean, I think that if Capricorns can be busy and available, I think that's the best for everyone, and best for you as well. And Venus is in mutual reception with Saturn by exaltation. So this has been going on for some time, and while Venus is in Libra, this mutual reception will continue. So if you've got Mars trine Saturn with Venus in mutual reception to Saturn as well, this arguably should really put you in a very good position. And Capricorn, perhaps you need to think about what it is that you want to achieve today. You are able to project yourself, you're able to project your ambitions, whatever those ambitions might be, and you can get people to take you seriously. And additionally, I think you're capable of being quite charming, and you can present yourself very well. And I think that in most cases people are going to like you and they're going to appreciate you, but you do have to make the start. You have to make an effort. If you, for example, today decide that it's all too much, that you just want to spend the day alone, if you want to do that, then it's not going to be very satisfactory, because there'll be nothing to get you going. There'll be nothing to motivate you, and it all becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You feel that there's not much going on, and you withdraw, and it stays like that. But as soon as you're with people, as soon as you start to engage with people, you will find, Capricorn, that things start moving, and in the end it can be a very successful day. Aquarius. It's great that the moon is in Aquarius. It's in your sign, and in Aquarius, of course, it makes a conjunction to Pluto, because Pluto is going to stay in Aquarius until the 2040s, and so that's a permanent feature of the Aquarian landscape. And so moon conjunct Pluto does indicate to me that you have a strong sense of who you are. Certainly a stronger sense than yesterday. I think that yesterday perhaps you weren't too sure of the way things were going. You felt that you just weren't in a mood to do very much. The circumstances weren't right. It wasn't particularly easy. You knew but you could have accomplished a great deal. Hopefully you did. I mean, I was very optimistic about yesterday in spite of everything. I hope you were able to make the most of it. But if you didn't make the most of it yesterday, well, today you get another chance. It's all to do with this grand trine. And I really think that this grand trine, Aquarius, can really propel you forward. And with the moon moving into Aquarius, there's no excuse. Now everything has come together. Now there's no guarantees there, of course. You might just decide to ignore what's going on, or you just might feel there isn't an opportunity. But if there's any conceivable opportunity, Aquarius, then I really do think that you can get it together. You can get it together in quite a big way. And one aspect we do have, aside from that moon conjunct Pluto, is Mars trine Saturn. So that is one side of the grand trine in water. So yesterday we had Mars trine Jupiter. Today we've got Mars trine Saturn. Saturn is your ruler, and so it's, your Saturn. It is your Saturn. I mean, it's always your Saturn, but Saturn is very strong. It's because it's in mutual reception with Venus by exaltation. I mean, Saturn. I know Saturn is retrograde, but I think that mutual reception is something very fortunate, but just makes you strong, makes you powerful. It gives you the ability to create effects. And so now that Mars is trine Saturn, Mars is trine Saturn as well, and it's a very strong Mars in Scorpio in its own sign. It's a time, Aquarius, to be pulling out all the stops. Whatever you can do, just make it happen. But do it in a methodical way. This is Mars trine Saturn. This is not anything crazy. It's just doing what is important and just doing whatever you can. And yes, you might be limited by opportunity, and you can only do what is possible. But I just think that you can achieve a great deal. I mean, I'm of course worried about this because, as I often like to say, I'm doing these forecasts of the 12 signs, and I have to try to be optimistic. I have to really make the most of the planets as I see them. And so it's not necessarily the case that you will be able to avail yourself of this opportunity. I mean, it could be disappointing if you don't have the chance, but somehow, Aquarius, you've got to do whatever you can to create the chances. Because things will change. Mars is in Scorpio. Mars is really doing a lot in Scorpio. It can do a lot for you. It can be very motivating. But Mars is not going to stay in Scorpio forever. Mars is next week is going to move into Sagittarius. So Aquarius, really, if you possibly can, do whatever is possible. You have to think about your own limitations, but also think about your own aims. You must have aims. You must have goals. You must have ambitions. Whatever those ambitions happen to be, do make sure that right now you give it your best shot. And really, that's all that needs to be said. Pisces. The grand trine is kind of dominating this video. Like, you can't get away from this grand trine. I think it is an important configuration. Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, all in water signs, and today we've got Mars trine. Mars is exactly trine Saturn, and Saturn is moving through your sign, and Saturn is in mutual reception to Venus by exaltation. So there's a strong Saturn moving through Pisces, and Jupiter is trine that Saturn. So that Jupiter-Saturn trine, it doesn't get exact until next year, but it's pretty much as exact as it's going to get. And it is in water signs, and it certainly affects you. And Jupiter is, of course, your ruler. And so you have an opportunity, Pisces, to really get yourself together. And things are moving quickly, or things can move quickly. It doesn't require much effort. So if you want something to happen, you can make it happen. And it's all just very easy. And if it doesn't happen, maybe it's because you've just exaggerated the difficulty. But there's no need to exaggerate the difficulty, and because there isn't much difficulty. And if you are confronted with something that seems to be chaotic, you just can't make sense of it, then you can make sense of it because of that strong Saturn. That Saturn in your sign that allows you to create order. And so you create order, and everything moves your way. And additionally, we have got Mercury moving out of Scorpio into Sagittarius. So Mercury moving into Sagittarius, it could be quite motivating. You might suddenly just have an idea about what you want to do, and it hadn't been entirely clear in the past, perhaps because you had been thinking and feeling and analysing, and you'd been experimenting maybe, but now Mercury is moving into Sagittarius. That could be clarity, and this clarity is going to be an ongoing process, because Mars is going to move into Sagittarius very soon. Next week Mars moves into Sagittarius. So with Mars moving into Sagittarius, and you'll have Mercury moving into Sagittarius, this can be a time when you can decide that there is absolutely something that you want to do, but you want to really want to throw all your energy into it. And perhaps the grand trine at the moment is kind of creating the preparation. It's kind of loosening things. Perhaps things in the past had been a bit stuck, and you hadn't felt sure of yourself, and it just all seemed rather difficult. But now with this grand trine, it's like you are the oceans. You are the oceans that are loosening blockages. The power of water. I was reading about, what was I reading about when talking about the power of the water? Water jets used for cutting steel. I didn't know that you could use water jets to cut steel. Apparently you can. The water is going so fast that you can, I don't know how it works, but that's a reminder that water is not just sort of weak and totally fluid. It can actually cut through anything. And maybe that says something about you, Pisces, that you can cut through anything, including steel. So, do not doubt yourself. There are things that you can do. You start by loosening things, and things start to move, and then now that Mercury is moving into Sagittarius, you're starting to get an idea about what you would like to do. And now that you start to get an idea about what you'd like to do, what you want to do, then you can start to really, make things happen. And when, as I said, when Mars moves into Sagittarius next week, that's when I hope that you're going to be, be really quite motivated. Finally, I should say something about relationships. Mercury is moving into Sagittarius. Mercury is a planet that can relate to you and the other. I mean, Mercury, after all, rules Virgo, your opposite sign. And so with Mercury moving into Sagittarius, it might be that you'll notice a few changes in some of the people around you. Some people might become louder. They might be talking more. But just because someone is talking more doesn't mean they're making any sense. I mean, some people, could be talking real nonsense, or they might have some serious misunderstandings with Mercury moving into Sagittarius. Now, it's a bit of a two-edged sword, Mercury moving into Sagittarius. I think, in terms of your own ambitions, I think Mercury moving into Sagittarius is fortunate. As far as relationships are concerned, it just might be that you notice that not everyone knows what they're doing, but at least they're being open and honest, and that is a good thing. And you should try to take people at face value. And if someone has been quiet for a long time, and you were wondering what they were thinking, as Mercury moved into Scorpio, then Mercury moving into Sagittarius, does create honesty. And so perhaps that Mercury moving into Sagittarius, isn't such a bad thing for relationships, because at least you know what someone is thinking and feeling, and that then can make it easier for you to make the right decisions, and also know how best to relate to another person. So those are my forecasts for the 12 signs, and now it's time to look at things from the viewpoint of the I Ching. So I asked the question, what is Wednesday going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? And the first hexagram I got was hexagram number 44, which is coming to meet. Now, this hexagram 44 is generally not considered to be particularly fortunate. And, the problem with hexagram 44 is it suggests that someone is in a hurry to meet us, and their hurry is not to be welcomed. And the implication here is that it's not in our interests. It could be someone who doesn't necessarily mean us well, or even if they do mean us well, we might not be able to benefit from the transaction. I mean, the real meaning, the symbolic meaning in the I Ching is, relates to marriage, and it relates to a pushy woman who wants to get married. That's what the I Ching says, but we can sort of transfer that to our own lives, and if we just accept people as they are and just do what they say, then there could be problems. And it's not just a pushy woman wanting to get married. It's a woman who is, again, I'm using the symbolism of the I Ching here, that once one does marry, you can't get rid of her, and she's really powerful, and she's just inappropriately powerful. And so that says something about the various relationships we might be considering getting involved with, whatever these relationships are. The relationship might seem straightforward, particularly if the other person is keen, but as soon as you've signed on a dotted line, as soon as you are involved with someone, or it might be a contract, it might be something financial, then you realize that you've lost a lot of power. And Greg Winkup in his translation of the I Ching, he doesn't call this hexagram 44. He doesn't call it coming to meet. He calls it subjugation. So there is a danger here that we lose power through a relationship. The relationship is not equal, and we might lose control. So that's the basic problem of this hexagram. And if you look at the structure of the hexagram, you see you've got 5 unbroken lines at the top, but then you've got this broken line at the bottom, and that broken line at the bottom might indicate the problem, something happening, someone worming their way in and just undermining the whole structure of our own independence. So that is perhaps a way of looking at coming to meet. But we do have the top line moving, and the top line moving is not so bad. It indicates that we are able to maintain our distance. At the top, it's kind of far removed from that bottom moving line, and we're able to maintain our distance, and we are able to maintain our independence. And so in the end, it's okay. We're not going to fall for it. And there could be also a feeling of just withdrawing. And, where there is any contact, we just naturally assume a conflict. And because we assume a conflict, we're not going to allow ourselves to be subjugated. And so this hexagram indicates a danger of allowing someone to have too much power over us. But it's not a real problem, because I think that we're going to be able to get away from it, and we're going to be able to create some distance. But when we do create that distance, when we do decide that we have to do things perhaps on our own, that does create responsibility, does create extra work. And the hexagram that this morphs into is hexagram number 28, which is preponderance of the great. And this hexagram can be quite tough. It relates to a heavy load. There you've got 4 unbroken lines in the middle of the hexagram with some very short handles. So by withdrawing ourselves from other people, we're giving ourselves a lot of work. We're having to take on quite a burden, and it's not going to be easy. And there may be moments where we think we've taken on too much, but it does seem that we did take the right approach. Yeah, independence does have a cost, but I think that it's a cost that is worth bearing. And finally, I want to look at the Mars-Saturn trine, and it is part of the grand trine configuration. So here is the chart of Mars trine Saturn, and it takes place at 7:05 p.m. London time. So that's in the evening in the UK today, Wednesday. It'll be earlier if you're in the Americas. It won't be until tomorrow if you're in Australia or New Zealand. So Mars is at 25:54 Scorpio, Saturn is at 25:54 Pisces, and there is this question: is it a good or a bad aspect? You can see the bad, negative side of Mars trine Saturn. Mars and Saturn as a pair can be connected with death and destruction and frustration and things just not working. On the other hand, it can be about structure. Mars in Scorpio sometimes needs some structure, some focus, and so Saturn can be about focused activity, and being able to concentrate on what matters and giving it everything we've got. And this Mars trine Saturn is perhaps made somewhat fortunate by the fact that Saturn is in mutual reception to Venus. So Saturn is in Pisces, a sign in which Venus is exalted. Venus is in Libra, a sign in which Saturn is exalted. So you could say that Saturn has the nature of Venus. So this Mars trine Saturn may be a bit like Mars trine Venus in a weird kind of way. So perhaps this Mars trine Saturn could be quite good for relationships. It could allow us to stabilize and get on with people in a way that is quite constructive. And when we're looking at Mars trine Saturn, we just shouldn't forget that it is just part of a grand trine. And Mars Jupiter can be excessive. I said yesterday that it can be too much of a good thing. It can be, if a case of if something bad can happen, it will happen because it's all too easy. It's all too straightforward. Things just flow. But Saturn creates some discipline, some structure. It allows us to take our energy, which may be excessive energy, and to focus it on the things that matter. So there's no reason why this Mars trine Saturn can't be very constructive, particularly if you put it in the context of this grand trine. But with grand trines we always have to be careful because there's just too much energy flowing. So we can hypothesize, we can theorize about what Mars trine Saturn is about, but we could also look at some examples of Mars trine Saturn. I'm not going to look at examples of people with Mars trine Saturn. I'm rather going to look at events. So one event that took place with Mars trine Saturn was the end of the First World War. So this is a chart for the armistice on November the 11th, 1918 at 11 a.m. I have set it for London. I'm not quite sure if that was the right thing to do. I'm not sure about the time zones here. Where exactly was that armistice? But Mars was certainly trine Saturn. Not exactly trine Saturn. I mean, Mars had just gone into Capricorn. So in the days preceding the armistice, Mars in Sagittarius was making a trine to Saturn in Leo. So perhaps that was the work towards the armistice. And then the moment Mars moved into Capricorn, still in trine to Saturn, was when the armistice happened. I mean, it happened, I think 0 degrees 1 minute Capricorn, which is kind of interesting because, Mars is a planet that you associate with war. When Mars moves into Capricorn, it's exalted in Capricorn. So you might think strong Mars means more war, but in this case it was the end. It was news about war. So that may be another way of looking at it. And Mars, square the Aries point. It's the global point. It's the end of a world war. So that really fits with Mars moving into Capricorn. Of course, notice also that Saturn is close to Regulus, and so with Saturn on Regulus, Regulus is the royal star, and of course the armistice symbolized the end of 3 royal houses. The Russia, Austria, Germany, 4 if you think about it. In Europe, of course the Tsar had already fallen by then in Russia, but the First World War in general, brought to the end of the Romanovs and the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the German Empire and the Ottoman Empire. And so that is Saturn on Regulus having a real impact on royal houses and on the monarchy. And of course, there was a new moon in 1914, a new moon eclipse, conjunct Regulus. So Saturn was conjuncting an eclipse that had happened over 4 years earlier. So that's a reminder that eclipses can last a long time. In this case, it lasted for 4 years. So the end of a war, Mars trine Saturn. Saturn brings some control into the situation. That's one way of looking at Mars trine Saturn. There's another war that ended with Mars trine Saturn, and that was the Vietnam War, or rather the fall of Saigon. So this is when the helicopters came in and were plucking people off the roof of the American embassy, and Mars was at 1351 Pisces and Saturn was at 1352 Cancer. So Mars was exactly trine Saturn when Saigon fell, that symbolic moment. And so again, Saturn is limitation. It's over. Mars is a war, and Saturn is saying just enough. Notice also Saturn is exactly on, pretty close to the United States' sun. The sun has its, the United States' sun I think is at 1319 Cancer, and so Saturn was on the United States' sun, and Mars was trine Saturn. So that is one way of looking at it. So the question is, what about Ukraine? I mean, there is Mars trine Saturn. Is the Ukraine war going to end? The offer is on the table. I mean, I think, if I've got it right, that Putin has said that if Ukraine completely pulls out of Donbass, Donetsk and Luhansk, then the rest of the conflict will freeze. I thought all that has to happen. And there are people who are supportive of Russia who think this is a terrible idea, that really Putin has been completely naive by making this offer. But it's there, it's on the table. So you could say that this, if you were looking at it, if you were looking at Mars trine Saturn, we've got, beforehand, we were thinking, well, this might be the time when the Ukraine war was going to end. So this is a chance, but I don't think Ukraine will take that chance, or Trump will take that chance. But it is an opportunity. I mean, I think perhaps you could argue the Russians have been quite naive making this offer. This is a reminder that Putin is a real dove. I mean, he is going against Russian opinion. Apparently, I was just before I made this video, I was looking at commentary on this, and really, I was looking at the Duran. If you've watched that, it's really good. He's looking at their view on geopolitics, and on that, they were really looking at Putin and saying he's being quite weak in terms of contemplating such an offer. But when this offer is around with Mars trine Saturn, maybe this is an opportunity for the Ukraine war to end. I suspect the West won't see the opportunity, and that it will be a lost opportunity. So I suspect that this Mars trine Saturn, although it could have ended the Ukraine war, I don't think it will. But maybe I'm wrong. So that's one way of looking at Mars trine Saturn, perhaps in a positive way. Saturn stops Mars, and it brings it all to an end. And then, should you get married with Mars trine Saturn? Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette got married with Mars trine Saturn. And so here it is. Here's a chart of their marriage. And Mars was very closely trine Saturn. Mars was at 2744 and Saturn was 2730. And the Mars and Saturn are in trine. That sounds good. Having a trine, stability in marriage, yes. But of course, Louis XVI was guillotined, and so was his wife. So the marriage did not have a happy ending. It might be tempting to say that, Sun is quite close to Algol. Well, it's not. You have to remember there's precession of the equinoxes. So the Sun would actually have been a few degrees away from Algol, although it seems close. But maybe it was close enough to have some impact. We know that, in the end, we know how it ended, and the Sun was certainly close to a conjunction of Mars of the Mars-Saturn midpoint. So maybe getting married with Mars trine Saturn isn't such a good thing. Now, going back to the Ukraine war, maybe Mars trine Saturn is a good time for acts of mischief. So the Nord Stream 2 pipeline between Russia and Germany was blown up in September 2022 when Mars was trine Saturn. So perhaps if you want to do acts of destruction, like blowing up a pipeline, we don't know who did it. I kind of think the Americans were involved, or there's some Ukrainians who have been arrested for it. So that might be a way in which Mars trine Saturn could work. And finally, what about medical procedures? Should you go under the knife when Mars is trine Saturn? Now, Ronald Reagan had a colonoscopy on July the 12th, 1985. And it was a really important colonoscopy because it hit the news. It popularized colonoscopies. And during his colonoscopy, they found cancer. But they found cancer earlier enough to stop it spreading, to just remove the whole thing. It was quite a complicated operation because colonoscopies weren't as easy as they are now. So having a Mars trine Saturn is not such a bad time to have a colonoscopy, because in a way you're looking for cancer. I mean, you don't want to find cancer, but you could say Mars trine Saturn is finding something that is bad, but at least you found it and you removed it. And the Moon was even opposition Saturn. You would have thought Moon opposition Saturn is not a good time to have an operation, but in this case, it worked well. I mean, firstly, they were able to find the cancer. Secondly, they were able to remove the cancer, and the operation was a success. And it popularized colonoscopies, possibly as a result of this operation and the publicity it got. A lot of people's lives were saved. So just because you have Mars trine Saturn doesn't necessarily mean that it's it's a bad event. And somehow Mars trine Saturn, it sort of fits, doesn't it? A colonoscopy where they find cancer. So I mean that's a way of looking at it, and maybe that's also a way of just thinking about testing and diagnostics. You know, obviously you don't want them to find something. I mean, I did have this question about medical astrology. If you go for a test but you're terrified of a bad result, so you deliberately choose a wonderful configuration, are you perhaps encouraging them or encouraging the stars to create a situation where you get a false negative? So for example, if you had a colonoscopy when the planets were in a wonderful position, and let's say you had colon cancer or you had a polyp that was about to go cancerous or whatever, maybe because the planets are in such a good position, they won't find it. So this might be a case of saying there is an advantage in having a colonoscopy, if Ronald Reagan is anything to go by, when the planets are not necessarily great, particularly with that moon opposition Saturn. Anyway, those are a few thoughts about this trine between Mars and Saturn. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy this video, I'd be very grateful if you were to like it. If you're not subscribed, I'd be super grateful if you were to subscribe. If you want to buy me a coffee, there's a link in the description, and I will talk to you again tomorrow.